Shalom and welcome to this home edition of the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be getting an update on Israel's situation in the Middle East. Warm welcome to the program. I have a very special guest all the way from Israel. His name is Neil Lazarus from Awesome Seminars, and he's been a regular guest on this program for the past 10 years. So in this COVID-19 times, it's excellent that we have an opportunity to interview him today. Neil, as it is in Israel, Boker Tov, good morning. It's great that you can be with us today.
Thanks for having me. I can't believe it's 10 years. Time flies now.
Oh, definitely. Really does. So for any of our viewers that haven't seen you or seen the older programs that you're on, can you share something about your Jewish background and how you came to make Aliyah and to live in Israel?
Sure. As you can probably hear, I grew up actually in the UK. I came to Israel age 21 as a student, or just after university in the UK. And have been here ever since, just outside of Jerusalem. And I truly believe it's like if you use the Bible and read the Bible, Israel is such a place where you can use the Bible as a guidebook. I mean, you just open it up and you're looking around, and it's an amazing country. And I'm just outside Jerusalem, about 20 minutes outside of Jerusalem, with my family. And as you know, I work as a keynote speaker internationally on Zoom. And as you mentioned, my company, despite everything, and I don't know, I should be embarrassed, is growing on Awesome Seminars. So yeah, all is good.
Excellent. Neil, can you share with us the work you do regarding Awesome Seminars? Because you're probably one of Israel's best teachers or lecturers when it comes to explaining Israel's situation in the Middle East. You do it in a fun, interactive, but also engaging style. And that's why I like you as a guest so much.
Thanks very much. Yeah, well, look, if you started the program 10 years ago, I think awesomeseminars.com started nearly 20 years ago. So I managed to get the name before all the .coms were stolen. I work as a keynote speaker, but my belief is really to try and motivate, educate, and challenge people. I hate it. And I remember it when I was taught about Israel in my Sunday schools, dying of boredom, thinking, please, the teacher, please just have a heart attack so I can read your book. The reality, am I allowed to say that? Well, yeah, a little bit. Bottom line is what I've been trying to do is to show people that Israel is an amazingly complex place. If I speak on campuses, which I do around the world, I speak to something like 30,000 people a year, post and after COVID. We're going to get through this. I always try and show them the choices that people have to make here. There's not always right answers, but the choices that face the Israeli government, whether it's vis-a-vis the Palestinians, the Middle East, we have elections coming up. There's many different political decisions that have to be made.
Neil, can you share with us what the current situation is like regarding COVID-19, the vaccine situation, because it seems that Israel is one of the leading lights in this country and could actually be the first country to really come out of COVID, certainly in Western Europe.
100%. The story of the fight against COVID in Israel is a success story. As you know, Israel is a startup nation, and our natural resource is medicine, technology, and it's been proven. We're now over half of the population has been vaccinated, and we're now entering a period of what's called green passport, where this week we're seeing shopping malls being opened, restaurants being opened, and going back to normal with the precondition that you have been vaccinated. Again, there's an argument there. but the vaccination seems to be working. The vaccination seems to be bringing the infection rate down. So there certainly is a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think we're a light to other countries, to other nations on how to fight this.
No, absolutely. But how are those being treated that don't have the vaccine? Because there's great concern and speculation throughout the media, because everyone's looking to Israel as the example, as the nation to lead us out of COVID-19. And yet we're seeing that with this green passport, this could actually affect those who, for health reasons, can't have the vaccine, or for ideological reasons they can't, could become a second-class citizens, not being able to get on a plane, not being able to get on a train or a bus, not being able to go to a restaurant or a theatre. Some of the things that we took so much for granted prior to COVID-19.
Right.
How
Look,
will this
this is all untested ground, and I'm sure mistakes will be made on the way. That's for sure. What's happening here is a social experiment, which I think is fascinating. This idea of no one's saying you have to have the vaccination. What they are saying is you need to be safe to go into a public place. So the choice is yours. You don't want to vaccinate, that's okay for religious reasons, etc., so on and so forth. And we're not yet at the stage of being able to vaccinate people under the age of 16, which causes problems when families want to go out, for example. And like I said, it's all experimental. But what it is saying is, look, it is ridiculous that we have to close all the shopping malls, or if we have to, and shopping malls have access for everybody, not just a green passport. They keep changing. But it's ridiculous. You can't go to the theatre. You can't go to a public space because it's dangerous. So I think the emphasis is not on discrimination. It's guaranteeing that people are safe. The decision is yours whether you want to take that vaccination, yes or no. It's being proven to work.
And talking about the election now, which is probably the big political story in Israel. I mean, this is the fourth election in 2 years, and I'm sure with COVID-19 as well, the Israelis are having a lot of election fatigue. No doubt we've had in this country as well. So how do you think this election will actually pan out? And do you think that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu can get that famous 61 seat majority in order to lead another government?
I think it was Winston Churchill once said there's lies, damn lies, and then statistics. So everything you're seeing in the polls at the moment, you have to be a little bit careful with. And we also know that many of the Likud voters, which is the party of Benjamin Netanyahu, will vote, will say something opposite to how they vote, just to confuse the pollsters. But what it does seem, with all of that reservation, what it does seem is that we are going, there's a couple of options. One, we will go to fifth elections. In other words, that Netanyahu won't be able to form a majority at all. Or that Netanyahu will come in with a very small majority. Now, there's a couple of things to look out for if you're following the elections. One, what's happening to Naftali Bennett, the national religious representative of the national religious movement in Israel? He could be the kingmaker. Okay, between, on the one hand, he's been very critical of Netanyahu, yet on the other hand, he's naturally tending towards the right. He's also openly said that he wouldn't sit in a government with Yair Lapid, who is the second largest party, according to these polls. So we look out for what's happening with Naftali Bennett. And there's other things I want you to look out for as the results come in. Look who didn't get elected. The game is also on passing the minimum number of votes in order to get in. What am I talking about? Well, there's a couple of things. There's an Israeli Arab party called Ram. Who cares? Well, one, Netanyahu has been after the Arab vote. Sounds crazy, but there's a pool of voters there who could vote Netanyahu. A recent poll came out showing that up to 26-27% of Israeli Arabs would vote Netanyahu. Nice. So he's after them. Now, this party called Ram has said quite clearly they wouldn't rule out sitting in a government with Netanyahu. They're an Israeli Arab party. As long as they get the budgets, they get something out of it. They've started to play the political game, which is a game changer. They're on the border of getting in or not getting in. If they get in, it's much easier for Netanyahu. But hold on, does that mean that Netanyahu's very small government will be depending on Israeli Arabs? Like what's going on here in Israeli politics? So you've got an amazing numbers game going on. If you want it in one sentence, something's happened in Israel, which is that the opposition to Netanyahu is not from the left, it's coming from the right. And that's an important game changer. In other words, that the right, the Gideon Sa'ars who split from the Likud, the Naftali Bennett's, these people are to the right. Ideologically, Israel is to the right, and the opposition to Netanyahu is coming from the right. So I actually think it's really quite an interesting election. Two last things. These are elections about COVID. So we started about talking about COVID, and the success against COVID is going to play in favor of Netanyahu. And it's also about Netanyahu's legal problems. One of the things that we could expect is, if Netanyahu is elected, is the passing of a law which would say that no prime minister who is a serving prime minister can be prosecuted. That would give Netanyahu more time before he had to face his legal challenges. Other than that, not a lot happening.
But what about the collapse of the Blue and White Party led by Benny Gantz? Because this was the big hope of the political left in Israel. I mean, it's a long time since anyone from the left actually won an Israeli election. And a lot of their hopes was on Benny Gantz and the Blue and White Party, but that seems to have disintegrated.
Look, the Blue and White Party split. And Benny Gantz, I would argue, shot himself in the foot with his supporters when he came into government with Benjamin Netanyahu. He ran a campaign of anything but Bibi, and in the end comes into coalition. Now, there's a couple of things. He would argue that it was better for me to come into government. Otherwise, we would have had a totally right-wing Likud government. I calmed things down. I guaranteed that the Supreme Court wasn't damaged. I strengthened democracy in Israel. Reality is, he's now part of the game. I think many of his supporters have left him for other alternatives. That's another question. Will he actually be even in the parliament next time? It's pretty borderline.
Wow. And what about Lapid from the left as well? In the government of national unity, he was like the Minister of Finance, loved by the left. What are his chances?
So it's interesting. Yair Lapid is interesting in that he's probably going to be the leader of the second largest party in Israel. It's a party which seems to be to the center left, very strong on the rule of law and equality, and leading towards a much more secular version of or a secular world outlook, if you like. He's doing very well. Tactically, we're in the last week, we're up to the run up to the elections. He's playing the opposite way. He's playing down this idea of, I want to be prime minister. And they're pushing more, we just need an alternative and we need a change. And you know what? It doesn't necessarily have to be me. The Netanyahu campaign has been strengthened by the fact that Lapid, and not Gideon Sa'ar, is the major contender. It's much more comfortable for Netanyahu to be saying, it's either me or Lapid, choose which one. You drive around Israel today, there's posters, Lapid, Netanyahu, who for prime minister. So that works with Netanyahu's campaign. The COVID situation works with Netanyahu's campaign. It's all coming together to guarantee a pretty close elections, but in the end, he'll probably get through.
And finally, on the Israeli elections, what about the prospect of Lieberman? Because in the last few elections, he's been almost kingmaker, to the extent that he's also been antagonistic in not wanting to join a government led by Netanyahu.
Look, the Lieberman's there, who stayed certainly steady on his votes, according to all the polls. But how the political system has changed with this splitting of the right with 3 or 4 major contenders coming from the right, as kind of his campaign is somewhat stagnated. In other words, he has a natural electorate, many Russian speakers. Some of those are moving away. Secular, he's running a campaign of, I want a government without ultra-Orthodox Jews, and to the right. But he hasn't made any major impact. His numbers are pretty stable.
And do you think that that Biden will have an effect? The fact is, there's a change of administration in the White House. Israelis before felt that they could relax with President Trump in the White House being really Israel's greatest friend in the world when it comes to politics anyway in particular. Do you think that the Biden administration, with its desire to push through the Iran deal, to regenerate, I would say, the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, will this worry the Israeli voters?
I'm not sure it's an issue within the electoral campaign as such, but long term it will have effects. Look, what's the difference between Trump and Biden? Israelis see, from our part of the world, we see much more, how does it affect the Middle East? How does it affect Israel? So what, love him or hate him, the Trump administration did one thing which was very significant. It took the Palestinian issue away from being the central issue of the Middle East. And what he was saying and proved, especially in the last months of the administration, was, look, there are Arab countries out there who are more threatened by Iran than they are Israel. And we saw the United Arab Emirates, we saw Bahrain, we saw Sudan. We also have Saudi Arabia, not ready yet, but there's a lot of unofficial diplomacy going on, and there's other countries as well. What Biden has done is gone back to the old school way of thinking of, let's put more money into the Palestinian Authority, which has been proven to be inept. Let's have a look, let's talk about reviving Israel-Palestinian talks as the central component of Middle East diplomacy. Perhaps we can talk or approach the Iranians. The Saudis are not allies of the United States because of their human rights records. So again, it's going backwards. Forget everything domestically, just on a Middle Eastern point of view. Trump's administration favored Netanyahu because it was the same populist ideology. What if Netanyahu is re-elected with a further right-wing government, which perhaps favors annexation, it's going to be much more problematic if he's got Biden in the White House rather than Trump, who was already suggesting he would favor annexation in the deal of the century.
No, absolutely. But also the fact that it took President Biden 30 days before he called the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is surely offensive to Israelis. But also the fact that Biden claims to be a friend of Netanyahu's, known him for something like 27 years, and yet couldn't pick up the phone to him and actually speak to him. I'm sure that didn't go down at all well in Israel.
It was certainly noticed. Like I said, it's not an electoral issue as such. It's not like the issue in the elections which are coming up next week, because we can't change it. The Americans decide who they want as president, not Israelis. I think we have to be careful to demonize Biden. Biden isn't anti-Israel. Biden isn't anti-Semitic. He's got a very different approach to the Middle East. I think mistaken, but a very different approach to the Middle East. On the other hand, be careful of, what's the expression, biting the hand that feeds you. The relationship between Israel and America, whether it's Democrat, whether it's Republican, is an important relationship. And it seems to have been, under Netanyahu, pushed to just the issue of the right favoring the right. There are many in the Jewish community in the United States, if not the majority of the Jewish population in the United States, who are Democrats. And I think it's very important that Israel should be able to speak the language of both parties and not just one.
So how do you think you mentioned just earlier really how that it's not so much the relationship between the United States and Israel, it's effectively the policies that Biden and his administration will be pursuing in the Middle East? And you have to give President Trump some credit for initiating what is historic peace agreements with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco, the warming of relations with Saudi Arabia, with the Sunni Arab world, as it were. And why would Biden then want to dismantle what is beginning to be a kind of very effective normalization process in the region and in the Middle East between Israel and her allies, and supporting the moderate forces within the region against Turkey and against the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, it's a great question. I think that there's an approach to the world of that we can solve problems by negotiation, not force, that we are able, that we have to deal with the Palestinian issue because the Palestinian issue is a human rights issue, that we shouldn't automatically be an ally of Saudi Arabia because their human rights records is appalling, which it is. So I think it's a different paradigm. They see the world in a different manner. They say that they see that Iran is containable. So if you see that it's containable, that somewhere along the line you can negotiate with them, you're going to take a very different approach. Like I said, and I think we're agreeing with each other, what was shown was that actually, for many of the Arab countries, the Palestinian issue is not the central issue anymore. And that there are many countries willing to do peace, make peace with Israel and do business with Israel. And if you have a look at some of the business opportunities which have opened up between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, including pipelines and the exportation of natural resources, so on and so forth. It's amazing. It really is quite amazing what can happen with a little bit of goodwill on both sides.
No, absolutely. The other factor I really want to bring in is that central to Trump's Middle Eastern foreign policy was to support traditional allies of the United States, such as Saudi Arabia, give Saudi Arabia that kind of diplomatic immunity, let Saudi Arabia kind of lead the rest of the Sunni Arab world, in which he's been able to kind of broker the differences between the Saudis. I mean, for example, the Israelis being able to fly over Saudi airspace is absolutely incredible. The Abraham Accords wouldn't have happened without the Saudi support. And do you think that with Biden's focus now on Iran, his focus on the concept of building a Palestinian state, could actually undermine the Abraham Accords?
Absolutely, 100%. Look, there's a couple of issues which we haven't talked about also, which is I think that you have to look at what's happening in the Democratic Party within the United States today. The Democratic Party today is being challenged by the far left. You could, if you wanted to make an equation with what happened in the Labour Party in the UK, is starting to happen within the Democratic Party and the fringes of the Democratic Party. I think, and that's why I said, don't alienate Biden, because at the end of the day, he's centre left, but his intentions are good. The threat is coming much more from more radical voices within the Democratic Party at the moment on the fringes, but fringes very soon can take a central platform, as we saw in the UK itself.
Yeah.
So to some extent, I think that issue of talking the human rights issue, talking the Palestinian issue, which is traditionally the agenda of the left, is also talking domestically to his own audience. And sometimes when we're abroad, we forget what's happening there, in the United States itself.
Absolutely. So my last question on domestic US policy, looking at Biden's age and having seen him with his press conferences, it doesn't look like he's going to be able to last very long. So, which makes the prospect of a Kamala Harris presidency essentially inevitable within the next year or a couple of years. But there is that danger, as you mentioned, that she is associated with the hard left of the Democratic Party. So how would a Kamala Harris presidency then approach Israel and the Middle East?
Bit of a shady question. First of all, we wish Biden a very long life, as we say in Judaism, until 120.
I think it's going
So,
to last that long.
so you know, I can only wish him a long life and a healthy life, so on and so forth. That's number one. Look, let me take a more morally correct question, which would be what happens even afterwards, because it's very clear that she would be the next contender for a presidency, together with other people. Who knows? So if he makes it to the end of his presidency, yes or no, let God decide, not us. Absolutely, and this issue of the swing within the Democratic Party and the wings of the Democratic Party, I think to understand what's happening in American foreign policy, I think definitely you have to keep an eye on. She represents a much more progressive voice, which could cause problems. Contrast that with what's happening in Israel, which is the expectation of a more right-wing government, where annexation and annexing Judea and Samaria could be a very real policy after these elections. When those two hit, you have a problem.
Now, according to Israeli security sources that have been made public, they reckon that Iran is only months away from nuclear breakout. Now, the Democrats under Biden want to reach out to the Iranian regime. They want to renegotiate the Iran deal. But if Iran then has nuclear weapons, despite the fact that the country is kind of falling apart and they're on the verge of economic collapse, this is a total game changer in the Middle East, isn't it?
100%. Look, skeptics of the argument that Iran could very quickly go nuclear have said, you've been saying that for the last 10 years. But the reality is, Iran has been stopped from going nuclear by many different actions from certain countries. So what we've seen is war by other means against the nuclear program, whether it's nuclear scientists being killed, accidents, fires, you name it. Their program continues to be set back. But we're dealing with a very aggressive regime. And the question is, how do you deal with it? Because on the one hand, no one wants a war with Iran. Iran would be able to attack Israel by land and sea. It will be able to use its allies in the north, both in Lebanon and in Syria and in Iraq. So all of that northeastern front is a very problematic and very real and present danger for Israel. And at the same time, allies in the Gaza Strip. So it would be a full-out war. And a very serious war, and probably the most serious war since Israel's fought in 1948, but with the advancement of weaponry that we now have 2021. So I think everyone's trying to avoid that collision. Everyone is trying to have war by other means. If you believe that the Iranians are willing to talk to you, that's great. But hey, naivety can only be described as your world perception if you believe that's true.
And also, you mentioned the threat posed to Israel from her northern border, namely the ongoing civil war in Syria, the build-up of of Hezbollah forces in southern Lebanon, also pose a big security threat. And we know that Israel has done everything that she can to prevent the Iranians really from developing a base and a stronghold in Syria. Can you expect to see any kind of major confrontation between Israel and Syria, or against Iranian-led forces in Lebanon and Syria in the coming months or years?
What's not being reported on a lot of the Western press is this low-level warfare between Israel and Iran being fought in Lebanon and Syria, and also the Shiites and some Shiite affiliation in Iraq. What Iran's policy is to try and create a means of transporting its weaponry from Iran all the way to the northern border to create a Gaza Strip equivalent, if you like, on the Syrian side of the the Golan Heights. What do I mean by Gaza Strip equivalent? A piece of land which is a pain in the butt for Israel as far as continual firing, continual insurgency. They want to heat up that border. Hezbollah is also a problem in Lebanon. Look out, though, that also within, and I keep saying this in our conversation, look at domestic policy. Because whilst that's how we see everything from outside and maybe from an Israeli perspective, Hezbollah's got problems in Lebanon itself. Lebanon financially is collapsing. There's demonstrations on the streets. You remember that huge explosion in Lebanon. What was it, 6 months ago now?
Yeah, Beirut in August.
Right. Who was held responsible for it? For many in Lebanon, it was Hezbollah. Okay, rightly or wrongly. So one of the problems in Lebanon to look at is, on the one hand, Hezbollah is being used by Iran, is a very aggressive front. On the other hand, they have their own domestic issues and have to look over their own shoulder.
And also on the Palestinian front, this is the first time in a very long time that the Palestinians are looking to have elections, which is pretty much unheard of, because the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, is very concerned and has been very fearful that Hamas would win those elections. But they think that this is important in order for the Democrats to get behind and push for a Palestinian state. What are your thoughts on this one, Neil?
Well, it's a very dangerous game because first of all, we've seen the elections taking place for the leadership in Gaza, and there's not too many surprises there. When we look at the elections for the Palestinian Authority, is Hamas going to take over? Will Hamas be a serious contender for power? We have to wait and see. Look, there's other people there who are throwing their names in, the Dachlans, the Marwan Barghoutis of the area, which also I think are interesting. The reality is, let's wait and see. Let me throw something into the discussion. Let's see if they happen. I'm somewhat skeptical still of whether the elections in the West Bank will happen, or in the end they will come to an agreement and somehow put it off. We'll see next time we talk what happened.
Absolutely, no, it'd be intriguing. And on the on regarding the Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria, and having visited Samaria 2 years ago, it's incredible, and just seeing those views up on those hills of Samaria, knowing that this is where the Ark of the Covenant rested, knowing that this is the biblical heartland of Israel, which most of our Christian viewers can connect with. How are they feeling now at the prospect that President Trump is no longer in power, and the issues of the settlements is going to become a major issue, not only in Israeli politics, but also in US politics as well, and also, European intervention as well from the EU?
Well, again, I think at the moment Israel, if we speak this week as such, everyone is to some extent looking at the elections. Although by the time we've had our fourth election, there seems to be a lack of enthusiasm to go to the polls again. It has to be said. I think that in many ways that the Jews living in the West Bank are certainly confident of a right-wing government coming power. So there's no threat from within to future building, and certainly the idea of annexation would certainly be favoured. I remind you, by the way, when we talked about annexation under Trump, the settlement movement was split. There were those people, Netanyahu and some of the leaders of the larger settlements, who were in favor of the deal of the century, right, of Trump's plan for the West Bank and Gaza. I remind you within that there was a plan for Palestinian sovereignty within that plan. It wouldn't have taken. I have great doubts whether that would have taken place. It required Hamas to disarm, for example, for there to be total transparency of their Palestinian leadership, which would be unheard of, but it was there. The settlement movement was split over Trump. Some of the more radical elements were like, we don't want any form of Palestinian sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, period. So this idea of annexation, especially in the West, we talk about annexation as if it's one thing. You've got about 3 different plans. You've got just the Jordan Valley, you've got the Trump plan, and then you've got the plan of the more radical or further right elements of the settlement movement as well. So we're going to see how that plays out in the weeks and months to come, if this election leads to a government, and that's still an if.
Also, concern for Israel is the fact that Israel's been taken to the International Criminal Court for an investigation for alleged war crimes. Now, this is extremely troubling. I know that Israel's not a member, nor is the United States, of the International Criminal Court. But what jurisdiction do they have to investigate kind of war crimes when Israel is effectively facing asymmetrical warfare, as they did against Hezbollah in 2006, and then, of course, against Hamas in 2014. Don't the International Criminal Court take into account this new form of warfare, that Israel's doing all she can to protect her citizens, and yet then find her generals and her soldiers then could be called to go to The Hague to face alleged war crimes?
Absolutely. Look, if you want one indication, when does the investigation of the International Court start to take place? It starts to take place on the day after the kidnapping of the 3 boys, which started the last war, or was one of the reasons for it. I find it fascinating that the Supreme Court can investigate Israel, which was fighting a war against tunnels which were built from Gaza into the West Bank to attack its citizens, was defending itself against rockets against its major cities by Hamas. Hamas, which is a genocidal Islamic organization, but decides to criticize Israel, and as a token says, well, we'll investigate Hamas as well. Where is this court when we're talking about very real evidence coming through of concentration camps being created in China and people just disappearing in China, poisoning of opponents in Russia? Where is this court? Okay, so again, I think it's exactly what you're saying is absolutely right. It's part of a more sophisticated campaign of public opinion against Israel.
And talking about Europe, Europe has really been hit very, very badly by the COVID-19 crisis. We've seen riots in the streets of the Netherlands. We're seeing unrest in many European countries, and the EU now is effectively not acting as one single bloc, and essentially Israel's been able to pick countries out of that bloc and develop very close ties with Poland, with Hungary, with the Czech Republic and other nations. Could we say that Israel can take advantage of the chaos that is now engulfing the European Union and their failure to actually get the vaccine launched to immunize their own people, which is really shaking the union to its core, and also, of course, the impact that Brexit has had on the EU financially?
Taking advantage of chaos is a little harsh. What I do think is it provides an opportunity for finding new friends and new allies, where Israel can help the spread of knowledge on how to fight COVID, because we are ahead, world leaders in vaccinations, world leaders in getting the COVID numbers down. So I think it's the opposite. No one wants anyone to have chaos. No one wants people to die. No one wants people to suffer. The opposite is, I think it provides opportunities for cooperation with Israel in a Europe which has traditionally been very hostile.
Oh, absolutely. And regarding the rise of anti-Semitism, and this is such an important topic that we have to deal with and we have to challenge. But the fact is that virtually the entire world has been shut down for over a year. So many people haven't been able to go to the streets very much. So we haven't seen any kind of violence in terms of anti-Semitic attacks. But what we have seen is a massive increase on online anti-Semitic posts and what have you. Is this a cause for concern, particularly, blaming again the Jewish people for the virus when anyone with half a brain will realize that this came from Wuhan in China, not the Jewish people or Israel.
Well, anti-Semitism always provides the opportunity to attack Jews and for different reasons. Anti-Semitism claims Jews for being Marxists, yet at the same time control the banks. It reminds me of that joke about the rabbi sitting on the London Underground, where one of his yeshiva students comes in on the train and sees the rabbi reading the Nazi Times, and he says, "Why are you reading the Nazi Times?" He says, "Well, you know, when I read the regular paper, everything is terrible. When I read the Nazi Times, we control the banks, the world, and
Yes.
everything is good." Right? So absolutely. Look, one of the things we've been concentrating on via the webinars which I run on awesomeseminars.com is training people, because countering anti-Semitism online, everyone can do on their computers. So it's very much been beneficial, been running online courses via my website, so on and so forth, which very much trains people how to write, how to recognize, how to counter, how to speak. So those have been very popular. So I think it's something which, your viewers can do and be involved in as well.
Absolutely. And how can our viewers support Israel, support the Jewish people as well, in what has been an extremely difficult year for everyone? But what has been alarming has been the rise online and the online abuse against the Jewish community, which is unbelievably unacceptable.
Well, I think number one is, for the time being, Zoom is here to stay. And
I hope not, because I want to go back to my studio.
Yeah, look, there are advantages to it as well as
Yeah, of course.
the obvious disadvantages. But number one is bring Israel to your congregations via Zoom, via webinars, via speakers in Israel coming, talking, exploring. You can even do virtual tours of Israel via Zoom. And there's a lot of ideas there. It's not just watching the screen. There's many interactive programs which I'm running and so on and so forth. So number one, bringing Israel to the congregation and talking about Israel and using it, whether it's an opportunity for text study, Bible study. There's a lot there you can do. Second of all is the doors are going to be opening soon again, and I think that we will be able to slowly be able to see visitors coming back to Israel. There's speculation that Israel will start allowing tourists who have been vaccinated to come into Israel probably by April, May. Although, again, we're election season, so you have to be a little bit careful with those government predictions. And to continue praying for Israel. So supporting Israel, writing about Israel on the internet or on the newspapers, phoning in when there's radio programs and discussions, and providing a voice for Israel on a local level.
And what's interesting, it was a very interesting article published in the Sunday Times on Sunday, which saying that one of the key nations to emerge so strongly out of COVID-19 is Israel, and particularly Israeli tourism. And they're talking about how that Israel could be the next Mediterranean hub, with the fact that most Israelis would have had the vaccination, that Israel is one of the first countries to come out of COVID-19, that will welcome tourists around the world. What kind of boost would this be for Israeli tourism? And I know, speaking to a lot of our viewers or messaging a lot of our viewers, they're desperate to get back to Israel and to be back in the Holy Land.
100%, and we miss them as well. Israel's waiting to really be able to go to the next stage, which is to open its doors to tourists, get the tourists back in Jerusalem, get the tourists back to Bethlehem, get the tourists back to the Sea of Galilee, to see the sites and the places where the Bible was written. We're just waiting. And I think with a little bit of faith and a little bit of hope, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that's for sure.
Definitely. So we've got about 10 minutes left of the program, and I mean, it's been a very extensive interview that I've been able to do with you, Neil. We've touched on, US policy under Biden. We've touched on the Middle East. We touched on Israel's situation. Is there anything new that I may have missed that you want to bring to the table that those that love Israel, love the Jewish people, should actually know about this time? That's slightly off the radar.
It's an interesting question. I think that in many ways we've really covered a lot of the questions, a lot of the issues which are out there today. But I come back to making a difference. I think that being stuck at home, there's two ways of doing things. Some people get very depressed. Some people are like, oh, there's isolation and I can't go out. And so spend your time with your family, spend your time at home, spend your time online, learning more about Israel. Like I said, the courses which I have run are popular. People writing to me is like, normally I wouldn't have time to do this, but now I'm learning online with you. I've organized a webinar with you, etc. So my challenge is not to be bored at home. And many people have more time, but to spend that time discovering Israel, learning about Israel, reading your Bible, and exploring the values that we have, whether it's Jews, Christians, and Muslims, as far as our love of Israel.
Absolutely. I'll bring up something slightly different to our conversation. And we know that, for example, in the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, the Jews living in the Middle East, in the Arab world, were forced to flee from their homes with the newly established modern state of Israel. I mean, for example, if you take the Iraqi Jewish community, all they could take is just their hand luggage with them, despite the fact that they've been living in Iraq really since Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Second Temple and took the exiles to Babylon, and having a community that dates back thousands of years into biblical times, being forced to flee Iraq. And we've seen this in Yemen, we've seen this in Egypt and other countries in the Middle East. And now,
there was a Jewish community also in Syria.
Yeah, and now effectively we're seeing the ethnic cleansing of the Christian community, which the Pope did highlight on his recent trip to Iraq, which was quite extraordinary considering his age and considering the security situation in the country.
Absolutely.
To give a voice to persecuted Christians. What role is Israel playing in not only raising the awareness and the plight of Christians being persecuted, but also giving them a voice in what is a very dark and dangerous region?
No, absolutely. I think Israel in many ways is very sympathetic to the plight of many of the Christian communities, given our past of persecution. So I think that we can understand much of the experience of many of the Christian communities. And by the way, it's something which people don't really talk about. And I'm not quite sure why. I think it's not politically correct to talk about persecution of Christians by Muslims in Western communities because it raises many questions. So certainly Israel is pushing this. Israel is pushing a message of zero tolerance for genocide at a time when it's been accused by the International Court of I don't know what. So I think you're absolutely right to bring that up as well.
And also, I mean, the extent that Israel, as we started off the program, is leading the world in terms of the kind of vaccine, getting its population vaccine so it can be actually COVID-free, or as much of COVID-free is possible. There's talk of Israel actually building one of these vaccine centers, actually producing the vaccines itself. How will Israel emerge? Because effectively what we've seen with COVID-19 globally is almost the impact of a kind of world war in which the aftermath of this, we see new nations emerge, we see old empires die, and new powers emerge. And particularly with Israel's kind of natural gas coming online, the fact that Israel's warming relations with Saudi Arabia and, as you mentioned, the United Arab Emirates and others, we could see a pipeline going from Saudi Arabia to Haifa as well, which would really upset the Iranians and the Russians. So can you see within the next couple of years Israel becoming probably one of the most powerful, most influential nations in the world, particularly in terms of innovation and information technology and AI technology that Israel's leading?
100%. Look, first of all, on the issue of COVID, part of what will affect the next 5 years is who opens up the economy first. Those countries which start to open up their economy quickly will improve their economy quicker and will be able to succeed in a much quicker way. So Israel opening up its economy is already taking the first steps to recovery. Second of all, what you touch on, I think, is one of those subjects which many on the West don't talk about, which is Israel is rapidly becoming a natural resource hub for the region. And you touched on a couple of things, which I would agree with. Look, part of the agreements with the United Arab Emirates was to open up the port of Eilat to their shipping. Now, why is that important? Eilat is has a much deeper port than the Suez Canal. So if you bring your tankers to Eilat and then use, as you mentioned, the pipe which exists from Eilat to Ashkelon or onto Haifa, which, by the way, was a lot of that was built on the during the period where Israel was talking and had relations with Iran prior to 1979. You're creating an ability to circumvent the Suez Canal, bring in bigger ships. Now, the twist to that would also be is if a pipe was, which is already in the works, taken from the Gulf through Saudi Arabia. Remember, Saudi Arabia and the Red Sea is near enough at Eilat. Take that to Eilat, from Eilat to the Mediterranean. That means you cut out all of the Strait of Hormuz. That means you cut out all of the Red Sea, and you're exporting straight to the Mediterranean. Add to that the discovery of natural gas in the Mediterranean, where Israel's already becoming an exporter of natural gas and hopes to open up pipelines to Europe. 100%, we will become a hub of natural resources in the region, combined with being a powerhouse for innovation.
Which is,
so I'm positive. I'm very positive.
Well, which is absolutely extraordinary, particularly as you see where Israel's come from in the last 72 years. Also, how will you be celebrating Passover, or as you say in Hebrew, Pesach, this year with your family? Do you think that Israel will be fully out of lockdown and that families will be able to meet and celebrate Passover? And that's what the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, promised.
I think so. I think that we will be able to go back to celebrating Passover in the way that we have done from generation to generation, which is not under lockdown, but rather with family or family and friends around the Seder table, recalling the story of the Jewish people as they exited Egypt and went to the Holy Land. And it's an amazing ceremony. It's an amazing event. I don't know if you've ever participated in one.
Yes, I've. Very special.
Right. It's very, very special. And it really is. Every generation remembers that journey of the Jewish people back to the Holy Land. And really, it's history and reliving history and reliving the Bible in a very special way. So hopefully we will be doing that in a few weeks' time.
Absolutely. So about a minute and a half of the program left, Neil. So do you have a message for our viewers? Where can they watch your web seminars, for example? How can they watch that, and how can they get involved in that? And do you have a message for our Christian viewers that Israel's been a little bit off the radar because everyone's been dealing with COVID-19, its after effects, but we know when this is over, our attention needs to be back on Israel, back supporting Israel and the Jewish people?
So one, definitely you can check out my website, which is easy to remember, awesomeseminars.com. You can also, if you like this discussion, I also podcast, so you can listen to those podcasts, which are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Neil Lazarus Talks Israel. But feel free to reach out. I will definitely answer any requests via my website. And finally, we hopefully will see each other, not only by Zoom, but how do they say, next year in Jerusalem.
Absolutely, that sounds great, Neil. And I want to thank you for taking up, giving me your time, essentially, and our viewers' time, to give us a real understanding of the situation that Israel really is facing in 2021. Superb. So thank you very much appreciate it.
A pleasure. Thank you.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's home edition of the Middle East Report. And I don't think you could have got a better update on the situation that Israel is facing in the Middle East and what Israel is emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic to become one of the most powerful nations in the world. And we know that this is due to Bible prophecy, because this is exactly what the Word of God promised. So that gives us a responsibility as Christians to continue to stand with Israel and to stand with the Jewish people, to show them our love and our support, particularly at this special time as they head towards Passover, known as Pesach. So thank you for watching the Middle East Report.